Hello, welcome to Musing Heavy, the site devoted to alternative reflections on hard rock and heavy metal. I'm Stephen Meyer, and today we're going to do part 4. Wow, a lot of material on this one. Part 4 YouTube presentation based on my essay is Conflict Needed for Great Heavy Music, the case of Aerosmith, UFO, and Yngwie Malmsteen. Today, it's Yngwie Malmsteen. So again, as always, follow the links below if you'd like to read the entire text. So let's get rolling into this one. All right. So zooming on down to the Malmsteen part. Okay, all right. So the Yngwie Malmsteen inquiry. And as I've started each of these sections, when we looked at Aerosmith, we looked at UFO, etc., I sort of started out with folklore, or sort of what I consider the biggest myth surrounding each of these acts in terms of this conflict and great art sort of connection that we're sort of looking at. And the folklore that I'm attaching to Yngwie Malmsteen is that his isolationism inhibits greatness. Okay. So contrary to the aforementioned misconceptions regarding Aerosmith's and UFO's career, i.e. Parts 2 and 3, if you want to check those out, this piece of folklore that Yngwie Malmsteen's isolationism inhibits greatness, this piece of folklore, I think is actually quite defensible, right? The other ones I basically refute, right? This one, I think I'm actually going to have to support. You're going to see why. I believe there's a subtle difference between asserting that conflict generates great art, sort of like we were talking about in the other sections, and the perils of actively avoiding conflict to create great art. So there's a difference there, okay? I don't think there's much evidence in conflict generates great art, but if you actively avoid it, that can be a problem too, all right? Okay, so the way Malmsteen seems to approach conflict is through avoidance, right? Well, kind of human nature for some of us, I guess, and other parts of life, maybe that's what some of us do when we're trying to avoid turmoil and conflict, you just avoid it. And I think that's kind of what Malmsteen does. And through his avoidance, he progressively does everything himself by limiting contact or input from other musicians, from producers, from managers, et cetera, et cetera. Yet this deliberate circumvention of conflict may hinder Malmsteen's capacity to build on his fan niche, and perhaps more importantly, impede his ability to grow as an artist. Okay, all right, so a little bit of background on Yngwie. In the early years of Malmsteen's career, which effectively began soon after he moved to the United States from Sweden in the early 1980s, he served brief stints in 2 fairly obscure bands, Steeler and Alcatraz. While he did co-write the songs in Alcatraz with leader Graham Bonnet, who actually was a singer in Ritchie Blackmore's Rainbow for one album, and he did receive a couple credits in Steeler, Malmsteen was in many ways a hired gun and had limited input into the band matters, right? So he rectified that pretty quickly by setting up his own solo venture, which he has pursued all the way to the present. But even at this time, even when he was a very young man and he came to the United States, he produced quite a massive stir in the guitar universe for his otherworldly speed and technical chops that arguably remain unequaled today, right? So whether you as we're going to see, Yngwie is a pretty polarizing figure. Now, whether you like him or you hate him, you have to admit his technique is pretty awe-inspiring. But like I say, there's a real love-hate situation going on with Malmsteen. Detractors have labeled him as an all-technique, no-feel player, right? So sure, he can play, and obviously there's a whole lot of hours spent learning his craft, but he's got no feel. Some, opponents of him would say. Or worse, I've heard it said to the effect that he's an arrogant show-off who has done little more than take, say, what Richie Blackmore did or even Uli John Roth did, and took their neoclassical style of mixing rock and classical music, which Yngwie certainly does, to speed-obsessed, almost comical proportions, right? So on one hand, you know, it's not everybody's cup of tea, but if you sort of like this idea of mixing classical and rock, which Yngwie is very good at, but then he plays so incredibly fast, right, for some people that it loses all effect. It's almost comical at that point. However, fans of Yngwie, which I am most certainly, I'm in that camp for sure, will defend his demeanor as appropriately confident, with a subtle sense of humor that a lot of people seem to miss. So he might come across as arrogant, but that could just as easily be read as confident. And he doesn't really seem to take himself as seriously as he might at first blush, because he does have quite a sense of humor as well. What matters most to Malmsteen proponents, right, is his unquestioned devotion to craft and, frankly, mind-blowing guitar prowess, which I would argue, if you listen carefully, displays considerable emotion interwoven amongst the speedy sweep picking and elongated runs. So I think he does have feel, right? Just because you play really fast doesn't mean you don't have some feel, right? At least that's how I'm hearing him. So I think he has a lot of emotion in his playing. Yet even the staunchest Malmsteen supporter, which I would say I am as an example, and there's lots of them out there, by the way, but I think most of us would have to agree with the critics that there is a considerable amount of repetition in his catalog, and it's a pretty immense catalog, actually. There's a lot of repetition in song structure, and there's a lot of repetition in his guitar playing, right? I mean, again, the critics would say, well, if you've heard one Malmsteen song, you've probably heard them all, or one album, they all sound the same. I hear some differentiation, but I have to admit, there is some repetition, right? Now, Malmsteen himself, I've heard in many interviews, he gets asked this question. Malmsteen himself is defending this as a product of an uncompromising artistic vision, and I think that's part of it too. But I think his persistent movement towards musical remoteness, right? And indeed, his conflict avoidance is at the heart of the repetition. As we're going to see, Malmsteen has become, he always was a reasonably isolated artist, but he's becoming more and more isolated as time goes on. And I think that has a whole lot to do with A, he's avoiding conflict, as we're going to see how that works in a second. And B, I think that's what's leading to the repetition, right? Because let's face it, the more you do yourself with less input from others, the less opportunity you have is to develop different ideas that are not just your own, right? So it kind of makes sense. That's going to lend itself to more repetition if you're not collaborating, right? Okay, so let's look at this a little more precisely. Yngwie's march to independence. Okay, so Malmsteen's solo career has always featured high levels of control, right? So again, we're not starting from a point of that this guy used to collaborate a lot. He always was the boss. He always was in control, at least once he got past Alcatraz and Steeler, right? And by the way, that's not unexpected for any guitar-based solo act, right? Most cases, the guitar player is the boss. Again, if you're sort of a guitar shredder. And so what Malmsteen is doing in that respect is not super unique, right? It's just maybe he takes it to extremes, as I think we'll see. Because the following table demonstrates how this isolation is really accelerating through time. So I'm going to just sort of dance through this fairly quickly. I'm not going to go through every album, but again, just to give you an idea. But I'm not going to give just an album sort of overview. I've sort of broken this up into eras, right? I have sort of my own unique classification scheme, I guess, when it comes to Malmsteen. And each era is based on how much willingness there has been on Yngwie's part to collaborate. Okay, so we'll start. So I'm going to go through this table again. I'll go fairly quickly. And then that'll give me an opportunity to mention some of the albums along the way too. And then I've got sort of a figure that we'll look at that summarizes this, I think, even more strikingly. Okay, so if we start back, his first solo album came in 1984. It was called Rising Force. So this entire era from 1984 to 86, I think this era is united, and I'm calling it the mixed inclination for collaboration. So in this earliest era of Malmsteen's solo career, there's a mixed sort of inclination to collaborate. So we've got Rising Force, Marching Out in 1985, and then Trilogy in 86. Okay, so the indications sort of tell you what's going on in terms of collaboration. While Rising Force and Trilogy list no co-writers, okay, should say from the onset, when it comes to the material on Yngwie's albums and the writers, he always writes and arranges the music. But sometimes he shares in the lyrics, and that's sort of one key collaboration. Sometimes he relies heavily on engineers and outside producers and mixers. Sometimes he doesn't. Sometimes he has a vocalist, sometimes he doesn't, okay? Sometimes he does all the singing. So we're gonna kind of see how that works. So as I say, while Rising Force and Trilogy list no co-writers, Marching Out features 4 songs with lyrical input from lead vocalist Jeff Scott Soto, the first vocalist to work with Malmsteen, and a lot of people really like Jeff Scott Soto. Admittedly, he only wrote 4 songs, but nevertheless, there's at least some willingness to co-write there at this point. As I say, otherwise, Malmsteen writes all the other lyrics and is the sole composer or arranger of the music. Okay. Also, although Malmsteen is listed as producer on all of these works, so the overall producer, if you like, he does rely quite heavily on, and again, all this information you get just by looking at the album sleeves, right? And that's where I pull all this information from. So it's not a secret. It's just that a lot of people don't look at this in the same detail, I suppose. So Malmsteen is listed as producer on all work, but he relies on a number of engineers, mixers, recorders, and mastering technicians to process these releases. So again, this is beyond the performance. It's who's capturing the music to ultimately, assemble it for CD or album release or download release or whatever. And Malmsteen plays a lot of stuff. So he plays all the guitars, as you'd probably expect. He usually plays the bass too. Sometimes he's got a bass player with him, sometimes he doesn't. And even if he has a bass player with him in the band, he'll still often play some bass. He usually provides some background vocals. And in this era, some of the songs he sings lead, but usually he's got another vocalist that's doing the lead. Okay. So we're going through time a little more. So when we get to 1980 to 1996, these are the peak years for collaboration, right? At least for Malmsteen, right? This is when Yngwie collaborated the most in his career. And it's still not a ton. He's still doing a lot. He's still the boss, essentially, but he's collaborating a lot, for him especially, in this era. So a number of albums were released: Odyssey, Eclipse, Fire and Ice, Seven Sign, Magnum Opus, and Inspiration. Inspirations actually is a covers album, so it sort of counts, it sort of doesn't, but I put it in there anyway. It's got a whole bunch of different vocalists on that one. These albums, though, are actually his best selling, so keep that in mind too. In his entire catalog, it's this era, these are the albums that sold the best. Well, actually, these sold well too, right? But these were his biggest sellers. Okay, so his peak years of collaboration: Malmsteen is the sole composer and arranger of the music, but shares the lyrical credits for many songs on these albums, right? I said, except for the Inspirations album, which is covers. The most outstanding examples of this sharing, the lyrical sharing, would be, I think, probably with vocalist Jolyn Turner, another ex-Rainbow singer, by the way, with Richie Blackmore on Odyssey. Jolyn Turner writes all of the lyrics on that album. No one else has ever done that with Malmsteen, right? So he writes all the lyrics. But having said that, Gorham Edmund co-wrote the majority of the lyrics, actually, on Fire and Ice, right? And Michael Viscera co-authors about half of the lyrics on Magnum Opus, right? So there's for Malmsteen, that's actually a lot of collaboration going on during these years. And also, Malmsteen relies heavily on outside engineers, mixers, and recorders, and even employs a producer other than himself occasionally on these albums, right? Which again is kind of unprecedented for Malmsteen. And as always, he plays all the guitars, plays some bass, provides some background vocals, and a few occasional lead vocals. Okay. But going through time, by the time we get to 1997 to 2010, a lot of albums released here. Malmsteen's really backing away from collaboration and really has for the rest of his career, right? So again, we got a bunch of albums here, many of them really quite good, but again, the critics would say there's a lot of repetition here, or there's beginning to be a lot of repetition. Facing the Animal, the Concerto Suite for electric guitar and orchestra is instrumental, but quite an interesting project nevertheless. Alchemy, War to End All Wars, Attack, Unleash the Fury, Perpetual Flame, Angels of Love, another instrumental, and Relentless, okay? And he's had a number of different vocalists here, but at this point, Malmsteen shares no writing credit, so he's done with that, right? He's writing, not only does he write all the lyrics now, or sorry, all the music and arrange it, he writes all the lyrics, right? And he's got some notable vocalists in this era too. Tim Ripper Owens sings on a couple of these albums. Doogie White, yet another ex-Rainbow vocalist. So he really grabbed a lot of Ritchie Blackmore's hand-me-downs, so to speak. It's maybe not a fair way to put it, but a lot of vocalists who work with Ritchie Blackmore, right? And Tim Ripper Owens has done a lot of different things, Iced Earth, all kinds of things lately, KK's Priest. He's probably best known for his work with Judas Priest when Rob Halford was out of the band. So again, talented guys he's always had, but at this point, no input, right? They sing for Yngwie essentially, but they don't write any lyrics. They have nothing to do with writing the music. And also at this point too, he becomes noticeably more involved with engineering and mixing, but he still relies on some of the other professionals. So again, when you read the album jackets, you'll see an engineer, and in the past it would be somebody else. Now it will be somebody and Malmsteen, right? So he's getting more and more involved in the production in the overall processing of the music as well, right? And again, he's still playing all the guitars, playing the bass, occasional lead vocals, et cetera, right? And then when we get to the most recent era, right, and we've got a few albums here. So Spellbound, World of Fire, which is a lot of instrumental there again. Blue Lightning is yet another covers album, and Parabellum, which was just released recently. By the most current era, Malmsteen is pretty much doing everything, right? Most significantly, he handles all the vocals. And if other musicians are listed, it's only for the drum and the keyboard positions. That's it. So Yngwie does everything except for drums and keyboards, right? And he sings. So he no longer has a vocalist. Not only, from the previous era, he had vocalists, but they didn't do any writing. Now he doesn't even have vocalists. It's all him. If there's any singing, he does it, right? And this is also significant too, I think, in this maximum isolation era. All composing, arranging, and producing remains with Malmsteen. But now he appears to be the primary engineer and mixer as well. So he has very limited outside collaboration in the processing of the music either, right? So he's really closing in on everything. At this point, he's virtually a one-man show, other than having a drummer and a keyboardist, which he is telling exactly what he wants them to do, right? Okay, and just real quickly, another way of showing this, I suppose, we'll have a look. I put together a little graph here. So you can see, sort of saying what I was saying, but maybe I can say this quickly, a little more succinctly. So we got levels of collaboration. You got the collaboration sort of on the vertical axis and time, right? So those four eras that I sort of put together. And what I did is I just sort of ranked it 1 to 3, right? And basically you got a 1, right? If in terms of from Malmsteen's perspective, if he was using a co-writer, if he relies significantly on a producers and engineers and mixers, et cetera, and if he's got a singer other than himself. So in the earliest era, I actually gave that a 2.5, right, in terms of collaboration, because he uses co-writers a little bit, really on just one album in that era. So I thought, okay, that's a 0.5. But the other two, for sure, he's definitely relying significantly on producers, engineers, and mixers. And he definitely has a singer other than himself, right? When we get to 1988 to 1996, as I said, this is his maximum time of collaboration because he's doing all three of these things. He's using co-writers, he's relying significantly on producers and engineers, and always has singers other than himself. But by the time we get to 1997 to 2010, now you can see the trend, right? Less and less collaboration as we go through time, once we get past his peak years, right? He's not using co-writers at all, and never has since this era, really. So no co-writers. He's relying less and less on producers and engineers. So I don't even think we could say it's significant. He has some reliance there, but it's not significant. He's doing more and more of that. And the only thing that's staying from this era is that he's using singers other than himself. But in the latest era, that even changes. So he's doing none of this over the last 10 years or so, right? No co-writers. He's hardly relying on producers, engineers, mixers at all. He's doing most of that himself, and he's doing all the singing, right? So it's a march towards isolationism is what was happening with Malmsteen, right? Less and less collaboration. And as I've said, and I'll reiterate this later, this is conflict avoidance for reasons we're going to see. And it's also probably what's leading to his biggest criticism, even by some of his fans. It's also leading to the repetition, because it's only one mind that's creating this music. In the past, sure, he was the big mind in it, but he had other people that were giving some input, whether they be producers, engineers, or indeed vocalists offering lyrics. Okay. All right, let's bounce right back into the essay here. Okay. So we'll talk about some of the conflict here, and then sort of how Yngwie deals with it by essentially avoiding it. According to several interviews available through YouTube and the like, Soto, Turner, and to some degree Becerra, so some of his previous vocalists, have demonstrated considerable angst and or bewilderment regarding their past relationships with Malmsteen. Most of the hard feelings seem centered on the downplaying of any collaborative efforts, and depending on what you read, Malmsteen's insistence that he wrote everything, right? Again, I'm not taking sides here. I'm just going by what I read on the album jackets, my CD booklets, etc. It says pretty clearly that in that era, right, in that era of collaboration, that these vocalists were writing the lyrics. It says right on the jacket. So I have to believe that's true, that Yngwie's kind of trying to rewrite history when he's saying he did everything, that he wrote everything. So that just isn't the case. You can see that. I mean, you could look at it the other way and say, well, is it possible that it was just written on the CD package and Yngwie was just saying, yeah, I'm going to give you credit even though I did everything, and then later regretted doing that? I kind of doubt it. That doesn't really seem consistent with how Yngwie runs, right? If he did it, he's going to tell you he did it right at the time. So he's not going to put that on the CD jacket or album jacket. So it's kind of like he's either conveniently forgetting or kind of rewriting history here, right? So there's that side. So the vocalists are, they're a little angry about that, saying, hey, I did do some stuff here, and kind of stop trying to write me out of history here. And then Malmsteen has often said, reports have widely circulated regarding Malmsteen's palpable annoyance with hired help who seemed to think they were on equal footing, right? So usually he'd fire back and say, well, look, we were never on equal footing here. I'm the boss. I tell you what to do, and basically that's how it is, right? Indeed, one can surmise that Malmsteen was actually in a predicament, right? If you kind of think back to sort of when he was collaborating a little bit, he apparently realized that to expand his audience, he needed to cooperate a little bit. Again, more people involved in the stew, you're going to get at least, maybe the stew's not better tasting, but at least it'll be different, right? And he knew he needed to cooperate, particularly with the vocalist or lyricist. But you could tell he absolutely hated yielding any control, right? Which I think is kind of why he's sort of trying to rewrite history now, or at least he greatly regretted it later on. So with the benefit of hindsight, three outcomes were inevitable. I mean, at the time, I guess we could have predicted, but now it seems pretty obvious that it kind of had to go the way it went. That first of all, the years of collaboration with Malmsteen inevitably couldn't last. He just doesn't have the personality for it, right? And second, wider commercial appeal would be increasingly elusive, because again, it's just his vision. And when he's not collaborating with other people, you're not going to get different ideas, right? It's just going to be one person's vision. And once the Guitar Hero sensation was passé for most fans, Malmsteen would only sell to an increasingly narrow audience of guitar zealots, right? Which I guess I'd be part of that audience, right? I mean, when we talked about UFO in part 3, I sort of talk about that, you know, if you're interested in that, sort of the rise and fall of guitar heroism, right? And much of Malmsteen's career is well outside of that, right? Where guitar heroism is sort of over. And so Malmsteen's audience is largely going to be a very niche-based audience. Wide appeal seems almost impossible, especially without, say, a more commercial vocalist who's going to maybe pull them more towards the mainstream, which again is not going to happen because he's no longer collaborating to any degree, right? So that's essentially what happened. Since the late 1990s, Malmsteen has employed only hired guns who clearly understood their role, right? And that generated a whole lot less drama for him, right? He's not collaborating. He doesn't want collaboration. Basically, you sing this, you sing it this way, and that's that. And that's what I'm hiring you to do, right? He truly wrote everything. So while in the past, you know, he certainly didn't, even if you think he's saying he did. But since the late 1990s, yes, 100%, he's definitely writing everything. And he's becoming more involved in the processing of albums. Along with producing, he's being credited with engineering, mixing, etc. And most recently, he's handling all the vocals himself. So that abandons, so again, that's avoiding the potential problematic, having to deal with problematic singers, for instance, right? If you don't have a singer, you know, basically, you know, you don't have the problem of, you know, of trying to collaborate with them if you want to do that, or you don't have the problem with trying to tell them exactly what to do. You're just doing it yourself, right? Okay, so one might view this as an artist's attempt at sharpening the focus of his musical visions by becoming increasingly unfettered by outside influence. I guess you could look at it that way. And I think this is genuinely part of Malmsteen's motivation for becoming more inward looking, essentially. But he had these inclinations from the very beginning, right? If we, again, when we go back to that first era, right? He already was doing most of it, and he always was the boss, right? He collaborated when he wanted to. Otherwise, he merely told musicians what to do, which is kind of, that's been his MO really from the beginning. Yet this approach was obviously creating conflict for Malmsteen when, for example, execution of his musical orders were not optimal, or when credit had to be shared, right? And if he shares credit, he's got to share some of the spotlight, and that doesn't seem to be so much his thing either, right? So given that the watering down of Malmsteen's artistic vision was never really at risk, he always was really in control, right? It's evident to me that Yngwie's progression towards doing everything was primarily motivated to avoid conflict, right? And let's face it, probably to save some money as well. I mean, if you're doing all the singing, you don't have to employ a vocalist, so you're probably saving money as well, right? But what's happening when he becomes this isolated? Well, he's avoiding conflict, that's for sure, right? And what's left for the fan base? Well, the fan base of guitar enthusiasts, right, continue to get a regular dose of guitar wizardry. And I bought them all. I've got all the studio albums, quite a few live albums too, right? And I enjoy them, don't get me wrong. But the songs have become almost interchangeable from album to album. I mean, I have to admit that. And I listen to his stuff closely, but you could cherry pick different songs from different albums, flip them around, and they wouldn't sound out of place on any other album because they really are interchangeable in a lot of ways, right? The repetition of ideas, which really permeates much of his catalog since the late 1990s, really since he stopped collaborating, because when he was collaborating, I didn't hear the same repetition, right? And this is a concern, let's face it, even for the hardcore fan like me, this is a concern, right? Now, Malmsteen certainly pushed the envelope of guitar playing with his first few records, and he deserves to be recognized as a revolutionary talent. I don't think there's any doubt about that. But can anyone pinpoint what he has really added in recent decades, right? It's sort of like being impressed with a weightlifter, right, that establishes a benchmark in feats of strength, but that weightlifter continues to lift the same weight year after year after year, right? Sure, it's still extraordinary, and it's still something that most people on earth would never be able to do, but its entertainment value fades as time goes by, right? So figuratively, Yngwie has been lifting the same weight since his peak collaborating years and ceased to make any significant progression thereafter. I'm kind of sad to say, right? So Yngwie's arpeggios from hell are incomparable. I mean, the guy, if you've never heard Yngwie, take 2 minutes on YouTube and Google anything by him. And I'm telling you, the speed this guy can play at, speed and clarity, is jaw-dropping. But he's kind of doing the same stuff all the time, right? So his playing is incomparable. But how many times can it astound even somebody like me, who's a guitar freak, if continuously offered in roughly the same song-type context, right? I think that's where we're at. Okay, so just to wrap this up, thus the case of Yngwie Malmsteen does not directly refute or provide confirmation of the notion that conflict creates great art. Okay, I don't think it doesn't add to it or it doesn't subtract from it, really. However, it does imply that if an artist becomes too fixated on actively avoiding conflict, the art may suffer. Okay, specifically, there really is no evidence to suggest that any conflict that occurred while Malmsteen was working, say, with Joe Lynn Turner or Jeff Scott Soto or Edmund or Becerra, the vocalist, right, that any of this was directly tied to the quality of the albums released during his peak years of collaboration, right? So again, we can't really say that conflict's helping or hurting at that point. I think, though, we are on much stronger footing to point out that these alliances provided variation. And they did. If you listen to it, there's a big difference there. Within Malmsteen's catalog, and probably not coincidentally, have become his best-selling albums, right? Okay. And it's also apparent that frustrations with the collaborative process moved Malmsteen to become more insular, and in all likelihood is the prime reason for his more recent problem of repetitiveness, right? I love Yngwie. I'm a big fan, right? But since he stopped collaborating, the repetition, I think, is becoming increasingly a problem. So, avoiding conflict, if you purposely try to avoid conflict, and in your approach of doing that is to become more insular and just start doing more and more yourself, ultimately, there's a good chance your art could suffer. That's it for this one. Check out part 5, where I'm going to wrap a lot of this stuff up. I'm going to bring a couple new things in too, but I'm going to sort of wrap up this big 5-part series. And hopefully I will see you there. Well, I won't actually see you, but maybe you'll see this face talking on this screen. I don't know. Take care.